10 rules that turn an average person into a millionaire. Financial consultant Thomas Corley spent 5 years studying 233 wealthy people, 177 of whom built their wealth entirely on their own, with no inheritance. At the same time, he studied 128 people living below the poverty line. The difference between these two groups isn't luck. It comes down to 10 specific, boring, repetitive actions that one group does every single day and the other group never does at all. A separate study by Richify found that 93% of self-made millionaires invest through ordinary index funds, not through insider information, not through lucky bets on individual stocks, through the most boring, most accessible tool available to literally anyone. Today, we're breaking down the 10 rules that actually explain those numbers. And this isn't going to be a short video full of vague statements. We're going deep into each rule with real mechanics, real numbers, and real stories of people who built billion-dollar fortunes doing exactly this and nothing else. Rule number 6 is one most people can't physically force themselves to follow, and that's exactly why it works better than anything else. And at the end, I'll tell you which of these 10 rules millionaires themselves say they'd implement first if they had to start over. Stick around until the end. It's worth it. Rule 1. The gap between income and spending matters more than income itself. The number one predictor of wealth isn't salary. It's how much of that salary is left over. Someone earning $80,000 a year who saves 30% of it will, over decades, build more wealth than someone earning $200,000 who saves only 5%. The formula is simple. Wealth equals income minus expenses, multiplied by time and by investment returns. That sounds like basic math because it is, and that's exactly why most people ignore it. It seems too simple to be the real secret to wealth. People go looking for complicated schemes, insider information, the right moment to enter the market, when in reality, everything comes down to this gap, which can only be widened in two ways: earn more or spend less. In practice, the second option turns out to be far more controllable because it doesn't depend on the job market, your employer, or the state of the economy. Warren Buffett put it directly: pay yourself first and only then spend whatever's left, never the other way around. It's this principle, not salary size, that separates people who build capital from people who simply earn a lot and save nothing. There are dozens of documented cases of people with very modest salaries, school teachers, secretaries, mechanics, who died leaving behind portfolios worth several $1,000,000, simply because they consistently saved the gap between income and spending for decades and invested it. And the reverse is just as true. There are dozens of stories of sports and entertainment stars with multi-million-dollar contracts who filed for bankruptcy within a few years, because their spending grew even faster than their income. There's an important nuance here. The gap between income and spending isn't about strict deprivation on everything. It's about a deliberate choice: what to spend money on with genuine enjoyment, and what to cut without regret. The millionaires in Corley's study didn't live in poverty. They simply directed their freed-up money toward an asset that grows instead of an asset that loses value the moment it's purchased. Which brings us to the next question: where exactly should that money go so the gap actually turns into capital instead of just sitting there doing nothing? That takes us to rule number 2. Rule 2. Invest through simple index funds instead of trying to beat the market. 93% of self-made millionaires use diversified index funds. They don't pick individual stocks, and they don't try to time the perfect entry point. Every single month, for decades, the same amount, regardless of whether the market is up or down. This is called dollar cost averaging, and it works precisely because it removes emotion from the process. A person doesn't need to guess whether to buy today or wait for a dip. They simply buy on schedule, month after month, and on average get a favorable price because sometimes they buy high and sometimes they buy low, and it evens out over time. Vanguard founder John Bogle was the first to turn index funds into a mainstream tool, precisely because he proved that the vast majority of professional fund managers fail to beat a simple market index over the long run. The idea sounded revolutionary back in the 1970s. Don't pay expensive managers to try to beat the market. Just buy the entire market through one instrument with minimal fees. Today, that idea has become mainstream, precisely because decades of data confirmed it outperforms active management in the overwhelming majority of cases. Warren Buffett publicly made a 10-year bet that a plain index fund would outperform a portfolio of expensive hedge funds, and he won that bet by a landslide. That's especially telling, given that Buffett himself is one of the greatest investors in history, someone who made his fortune by actively picking individual companies. But even he publicly admitted, for the vast majority of people, including professionals, a simple, boring index fund beats trying to outsmart the market. Let's be honest here for a second. Picking individual stocks can absolutely produce higher returns than an index fund, but the data shows that doing it successfully requires either an enormous amount of time spent on analysis or insider information, or plain luck. For someone who wants to build capital systematically, rather than turn investing into a full-time hobby, the index fund remains the most reliable tool available. We've covered where to invest, but for money to actually end up there consistently, rather than only when the mood strikes, you need a mechanism that removes human willpower from the equation entirely. That's rule number 3. Rule 3. Automate your savings before the money ever reaches your hands. 95% of the millionaires in Corley's study saved 20% of their income or more, and many of them set up automatic transfers. 10% went straight to a retirement account, another 10% to an investment account, before the person even saw that money hit their checking account. The psychology here is fairly simple but highly effective. Money a person can physically see in their account gets mentally categorized by the brain as available to spend. Money that automatically disappears from the account on payday and shows up immediately in an investment account gets psychologically categorized as already spent, just not on consumption, but on the future. Within a few months of this kind of automation, a person stops even noticing that amount in their budget because the brain adapts to whatever income remains as the new normal. Personal finance author Amit Sethi gives exactly this advice to people in their early 20s. Set up automatic investing starting from your very first paycheck, while the amount still feels small, because that's precisely when the habit forms that will last a lifetime. He says directly, if you wait for a more convenient moment, or for your income to grow, the habit never actually forms because postponing the decision becomes the habit itself. The practical mechanics here are extremely simple and available to anyone today. Set up an automatic transfer of a fixed percentage of your income to an investment account through your banking or brokerage app. Time to your payday. Set it up once, and the system runs itself without relying on willpower, which, as we all know, is a limited resource that tends to fail exactly in the moments of temptation to spend on something unnecessary. But you can only automate what hasn't already been eaten up by the single largest expense most people have. Which brings us to rule number 4. Rule 4. Keep housing costs below 25% of income. Housing is the largest expense category for most people, and it's usually the one that eats into the ability to invest the most. Millionaires in the Rich Habits study consistently kept their housing costs below a quarter of their net income, avoiding the trap of buying the most expensive home a bank was willing to approve them for. This is one of the most overlooked traps in financial planning. Banks approve mortgages based on how much a person can theoretically afford to pay, without any regard for whether anything is left over for investing, emergencies, or life in general. Many people take out the maximum loan they qualify for, reasoning that the bank approved it, so I must be able to afford it, and turn themselves into hostages of mortgage payment for the next 20 or 30 years, with zero room to maneuver. Warren Buffett is once again the clearest example. He bought his house in Omaha back in 1958 and still lives in it today, even though he could buy a mansion anywhere in the world. Every dollar he didn't spend on a more prestigious home kept compounding in investments instead for decades. And that decision, made almost 70 years ago, became one of the foundations of his fortune. Not because the house itself made him money, but because the money he didn't spend on a bigger house kept growing in his business, instead of disappearing into mortgage interest and the upkeep of a larger property. This doesn't mean living in a basement to save money. It means making the housing decision based on the question, how much can I spend on housing while still investing a meaningful share of my income? Not, what's the maximum the bank will approve? We've covered assets that grow over time. But there's a flip side, liabilities, which can either accelerate the growth of your capital or completely destroy it. Let's look at the difference. Rule 5. Use debt only to grow assets, never to fund consumption. Strategic use of borrowed money, a mortgage, a loan to expand a business, can accelerate wealth building. But self-made millionaires almost never carry consumer debt, and they pay off credit cards in full every single month because they understand that every dollar spent on consumer debt interest is a dollar that didn't go into investing. The difference between good debt and bad debt comes down to one simple question. Does this debt finance an asset that grows in value or generates income, or does it finance something that loses value the moment you buy it? A mortgage on real estate that appreciates, or a loan for education that increases future earning power. That's one category of debt. A loan for a new phone, a car loan at a high interest rate, credit card debt carried over months. That's a fundamentally different category of debt, one that works against a person instead of for them. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos both actively take out loans secured against shares of their own companies. But that money goes toward growing the business or funding new ventures, not toward consumption. That's debt working in favor of capital growth, not against it, because the borrowed money gets invested into an asset whose expected return is higher than the cost of servicing the debt itself. That's a completely different logic than taking out a loan for a vacation or the latest smartphone, which loses a third of its value the moment you walk out of the store. The average American pays more than $1,200 a year in credit card interest alone, money that could have been working in investments and instead goes straight to the bank. Over 10 years, that's more than $12,000 that could have compounded into a much larger sum through regular investing instead of servicing debt. We've covered money, how to save it, where to invest it, how to use debt properly. But now we're getting to the most important part of this video, because from here on, we're not talking about financial tools anymore. We're talking about what actually determines the quality of every financial decision a person makes. And rule number 6 is the one most people can't force themselves to follow. Rule 6. Read at least 30 minutes a day. Not entertainment, but material that actually matters. 88% of self-made millionaires read at least 30 minutes every day. Biographies, industry material, financial analysis. According to another study, 85% read 2 or more books a month. This rule sounds boring, which is exactly why most people ignore it. But it's the one that determines the quality of every other financial decision they make. Why does this particular rule work better than the others, while being followed the least? Because it doesn't produce an instant result. A book you just finished doesn't turn into money the next day. The effect compounds over years, just like compound interest in investing. It's psychologically much easier to set up an automatic money transfer once than to find 30 minutes every single day for reading instead of easier, more instantly gratifying activities, social media, TV shows, aimless scrolling. Warren Buffett spends up to 80% of his working day reading. His business partner, Charlie Munger, put it bluntly. In his entire life, he never met a single wise person who didn't read constantly. Not one, 0 exceptions. Munger compared himself to a book with a couple of legs sticking out because he genuinely spent most of his time reading, and he argued that people who become successful not because of raw intelligence, but because of constant learning. He called them learning machines, go to bed every night slightly wiser than when they woke up, and it's that compounding advantage that pays off over the long run. It's important to understand This isn't about scrolling through a random news feed or short social media posts. It's about deliberately immersing yourself in material that expands your understanding of how business, money, markets, and human psychology actually work. Biographies of successful entrepreneurs, books on investing, industry analysis. Knowledge in this area genuinely compounds. Every book you read slightly changes how you interpret the next business headline, the next investment decision, the next opportunity. We've covered the habit that shapes how a person thinks. But what happens when, despite all the right habits, something still goes wrong? A business fails, an investment drops in value, a project shuts down. This is where the rule begins that separates people who keep moving forward from people who give up after the first serious setback. Rule 7. Treat failure as information, not as a verdict. A Deloitte survey of successful entrepreneurs and investors found that the overwhelming majority view failure not as defeat, but as a source of data for the next attempt. That's not just a nice sentiment. It's a concrete psychological strategy that keeps people from quitting investing or business after their first major loss. The difference between someone who abandons the stock market forever after one bad investment and someone who analyzes what went wrong and keeps moving forward adds up to decades worth of accumulated capital. The market is unpredictable in the short term for almost everyone, including professionals. The only way to win over the long run is to stay in the game long enough for statistics and compound growth to work in your favor. Elon Musk lost 3 SpaceX rockets in a row before the 4th launch finally succeeded, at a point when the company was on the brink of bankruptcy. By some accounts, he had funding left for exactly one more attempt. He treated every failure as technical data for the next design, not as a reason to shut the project down. If he had decided after the first, second, or third explosion that the whole idea was a failure, there would be no company today delivering cargo to the International Space Station and reshaping the entire space launch industry. A similar story played out with Tesla. The company came close to bankruptcy more than once, including in 2008, when Musk's personal divorce coincided with the auto market collapsing during the financial crisis. Plenty of people in his position would have shut the project down. He kept going, putting in literally the last of his personal money to keep it alive. We've covered how to deal with setbacks in the moment. But there's a bigger question: what time horizon should you actually be planning around? If the goal is to genuinely build capital rather than just survive one bad year. Rule 8. Think in decades, not quarters. Investing $2,000 a month at an 8% annual return turns into more than $1 million after 20 years. The math works without fail. The only real difficulty is staying psychologically steady through market downturns instead of pulling your money out in a panic. Let's break down the mechanics a bit more. In the first few years of investing, growth feels slow and almost unnoticeable. Most of the balance in the account comes from your own contributions, not accumulated returns. But after roughly 10 to 15 years of consistent investing, the curve enters an exponential stretch. Returns start generating returns of their own, and the balance begins growing much faster than in the early years, even with the exact same monthly contributions. That's precisely why people who quit investing after a year or two, not seeing results, aren't just losing time. They're losing the most powerful part of the entire effect, the part that only shows up over the long run. The path to wealth for the self-made millionaires in Corley's study took an average of 12 to 32 years, depending on strategy. The saver investors reached an average of $3,300,000 over 32 years, while the entrepreneurs reached an average of $7,400,000 in just 12 years, but with significantly higher risk and volatility along the way. This isn't a story about fast success. It's a story about patience, stretched across decades, regardless of which specific strategy a person chooses. We've covered the time horizon. But to actually stick to that horizon psychologically, stay on track, and avoid spending money on something unplanned, you need a tool for control. That's rule number 9. Rule 9. Track every single dollar. According to a CNBC survey, roughly 3/4 of millionaires use some form of budgeting. Not because they're short on money, but because it's the only reliable way to make sure every dollar has a defined purpose. Spend it, invest it, or save it. This rule is rarely associated with wealthy people because it contradicts the stereotype of a carefree, lavish lifestyle where money gets spent without a second thought. In reality, the discipline of tracking is exactly what makes it possible to spot money leaks that stay invisible without hard numbers on paper. Forgotten subscriptions, small recurring purchases that quietly add up to a large sum over a year, spending categories that crept upward simply because nobody was watching them. A simple psychological principle is at work here. What doesn't get measured doesn't get controlled. A person might genuinely believe they don't spend that much on restaurants, but when they add up every receipt for a month in a spreadsheet, the total often turns out to be 2 or 3 times higher than they assumed. That's exactly why regularly tracking expenses isn't tedious bookkeeping. It's a concrete tool that frees up money for that same gap between income and spending we talked about in rule number 1. We've covered how to control your own finances. But there's one more factor that shapes a person's decisions far more than most people realize, and it's almost never discussed in the context of money. Rule 10. Surround yourself with people who share your time horizon. Corley calls this rich relationships, the deliberate choice of a social circle made up of goal-oriented people with a similar attitude toward money and risk. Financial habits are a social norm that spreads through your environment almost invisibly. If it's normal among a person's friends to spend an entire paycheck on entertainment right after payday, it becomes psychologically much harder for that person to save money, even if they fully understand all 9 previous rules on a theoretical level. A classic example is the so-called PayPal Mafia. Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, and other early PayPal employees who kept investing in each other and sharing knowledge after the eBay sale, going on to launch Tesla, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Palantir. Their success is largely explained by staying in an environment of shared ambition and shared standards, a world where a risky startup was seen as a normal next step, not a reckless gamble, and where exchanging ideas and capital among former colleagues became a system, not a coincidence. This rule cuts both ways. If a person's environment consistently invests, discusses financial goals, and supports long-term thinking, it becomes psychologically much easier to follow those same patterns. And the reverse is just as true. Even someone with a perfect financial plan on paper will systematically drift from it if every conversation with friends and colleagues nudges them toward unplanned spending, skepticism about investing, or the feeling that saving money is boring and not worth it. Conclusion. None of these 10 rules guarantees wealth in a month. Each one, on its own, looks modest, almost unremarkable. Read a book, set up an automatic transfer, choose an index fund instead of trying to guess the next stock that's about to take off. But it's the repetition of these boring, unphotogenic actions, year after year, that adds up to the difference between someone who retires with real capital and someone who works their entire life for a paycheck and nothing more. If you had to pick just one rule to start with today, the research points to a fairly clear answer. Automate your savings. It doesn't require daily willpower. It doesn't depend on your mood or discipline. It keeps working even when you temporarily forget about it, because the system is already set up and running on its own. You can start with any amount today. The question isn't your starting capital, it's which of these 10 habits you build into your life right now, while there's still enough time left for compound growth to do its work. If this was useful, subscribe. More principles that wealthy people actually use are coming next. This channel is for educational purposes only. We share research and analysis, not financial advice. We are not responsible for any decisions made based on this content.